I'm Vern Bingham, and I was born and raised in Utah. At the time that Pearl Harbor, I was living in Salt Lake City and going to the University of Utah. I got in 2 years before I went into the service. But I had just gotten a new car, and so I asked my folks if they'd like to, that I'd be joining some service or be drafted. And I just told them that, why don't we go take a trip down the West Coast, which we did. We started out at San Francisco, went on down the coast to Los Angeles, and then home. But while there, the West Coast was abuzz in military. There was troop movements all the time, all over, and blackouts because they were concerned about submarines from the Japanese hitting the West Coast. So the West Coast was blacked out. But anyway, I went to see airplanes that was just outside of San Francisco, and they had a B-17 there, and I was interested in flying in the Air Force, and so that's when I made up my mind that I'd like to be in the Air Force as a pilot. Or a navigator. I thought of navigator at the time because I wore glasses, and I was pretty sure that they wouldn't send me to pilot school. I had stigmatism, so that I could go without my glasses for about 2 weeks and see pretty good. And so I took off my glasses, went to the recruiting office, and said I'd like to join the Air Force. And the sergeant who was in charge looked at me and started laughing, and he says, "You think you can be a flyboy and wear glasses?" I said, "I don't wear glasses." He says, "I can see the marks on your nose." Anyway, what he said to me, he said, "I'll tell you what, if you can come back in a week or so, and you can pass the eye test, I'll get you in the Air Force." And so anyway, that's what I did. And of course, I wore my glasses, took them off, come in, took the eye test, and passed it. So he got me assigned to Fort Douglas, which is in Salt Lake, as an aviation cadet.
Pardon me, but would you give us a date now? Give us an approximate time period.
Well, that was early 1942. I went immediately. He gave me a rise in in the regular Army there for about 3 days, and then orders came through and give me 2 weeks delay in transit to Santa Ana, California, for training in the Air Force. After reassignment there, I was assigned to Ontario, California, which is a pilot's school, and I was in primary flight training, and I did fine, but of course I couldn't wear my glasses. I got about halfway through, and I was to take my plane and fly to an auxiliary field and make a landing in a field, which I did. The only thing is, I'd lost my depth perception by then, and at 30 feet up, I thought I was on the ground. So I completed the landing, and of course I dropped to 30 feet, and one wheel went into a furrow, and the plane flipped over on its back. I was sitting in the plane upside down, and I turned off the engine, and my instructor had seen me go down because they watched us pretty close. So he come down and landed and come running over the plane. He says, "Why don't you get out of that damn thing?" And I said, "Well, I'm way up here in the air." He says, "No, you're not." He says, "Undo your belt, your head's in the grass." When I got out, he says, "Take my plane and fly it back and tell them to send a wrecker out here to get this one," and me. So anyway, I went and got in his plane, took off fine, had no problems. Only thing is, I got thinking about it then, and when it come time to land, I flew around until I scared I was going to run out of gas before I dared land. Incidentally, I landed very smoothly, but they had a review on me, and they didn't think to check my eyes. They gave me 2 weeks leave. I drove back through the southern desert of Nevada and back to Salt Lake and spent a week, and then I drove back. And what they did is they just put me to the next class. So then I went back to flying, and I finished up. My eyes stayed okay. I didn't dare wear glasses still, but I graduated from primary, and then they sent me on to basic. When I got to basic, it was now about 3 weeks later, and I didn't pass the eye test. So back to Santa Ana I go, and got reassigned as a navigator, because they give you a navigation, bombardier, and pilot's test. And I'd passed all three, good enough to be sent to any of them. So then I was sent to navigation school in Hondo, Texas. I'll tell you one thing that's unique about a navigation school. They're very efficient in teaching you navigation in a hurry. All the students we had a classroom, and you had a regular desk like a business desk with a good top and drawers, and we could keep all of our paraphernalia in it. And the instructors came to us. We never left our desk except we got a 10-minute break each 2 or 3 hours, and lunch, and that was it. Upon graduation from navigation school, I was assigned to a crew and went to Davis Monthan Field in Arizona with a new crew flying B-24s. This was what they call phase training, and we went from there to our first station was Blythe, California, which was built with revetments like they have in England to get us, I guess, used to a military field. And the only problem there was that the runways were cement, but the roads to the runways were blacktop. And it got so hot there that our B-24s would sink in the blacktop and couldn't get out. So then they transferred us to Salinas, California. At Salinas, our missions, training missions included patrol out over the Pacific. There were 2 places where you could go in and out without causing a blackout on the West Coast. It was at Big Sur and California, and can't think of the other point. But anyway, we flew at all day long, and it was usually always cloudy. We couldn't see the sun, or we couldn't see the coast. So of course our dead reckoning would be enough off that we'd never come in where we should, and that'd cause a blackout. One of the funny things I can remember about it is we'd fly out 2 planes at a time, and you'd be landing, we'd come and land, and another crew would be going out, and they'd say, "Damn you guys, you caused another blackout, now we gotta go out." But anyway, that consisted of our training, other than we went to Tonopah, Nevada to practice bomb with We had 200-pound bombs that we practiced bombing with. On one mission to there was 3 of us in a flight. Our plane was the lead plane, and we flew on strip maps because they didn't have full maps for us, so they drew up strip maps that were about 50 to 100 yards wide, or at least not very wide, and they were adequate, except that on our way back this one time there was building Cumulus, and I knew we couldn't get over them, or we couldn't get through them. So I told my pilot before we got to the mountains coming west to turn south, and I'd get him into Salinas, because I remembered from when we had gone home through the desert that the mountains ran out down there. So that's what we did. We called the other 2 planes to do the same. They were eastern boys and didn't realize how bad winds and turbulence is in a mountain like that. So they went their route. Both of them hit the mountains, and both of the title crews were killed. We went back, and the only thing different with us is we had maybe an hour longer getting home. That was my first experience with death, because some of them had wives that we tried to explain why they didn't follow us, and there was no explanation. From there, we went to get our crew was sent to, I can't think of the name, to Nebraska anyway, just near Omaha, pick up a new plane. We picked up a new plane, and to our amazement, it was painted pink. And so nobody would tell us anything. We only got orders to go to your next flight, and at that place you'd get orders to go to the next one. But anyway, we were scheduled for Bangor, Maine. From Bangor, Maine, we went to Gander, Newfoundland. From Gander, we went to Nuts Corner, Ireland. From Nuts Corner, Ireland, we went to Land's End, England. And from there, we went to Marrakesh, French Morocco. We did all of these flights in the daytime, and on the flight to Marrakesh, it was interesting because I got to use what is called a sunline. In other words, the only thing that we could shoot in the sky in the day is the sun, and you can't get a very accurate sighting; it's too big. But you can get a straight line that we followed. So in effect, we went southwest in the morning as we left, looking at the sun coming up. Then toward noon, we went straight south, looking at the sun almost straight above us with our sextants. And then as it turned evening, we did a landfall going southeast to Marrakesh. From Marrakesh, we went to Tunisia, and then from Tunisia on to Cairo. We went to Algiers first, then to Cairo, and from there we got our assignment to fly back to Benghazi, Libya, which was the base. We were assigned the 98th Bomb Group, and part of the 9th Air Force. And the 9th Air Force pretty much was the air cover and worked with the British 8th Army that was fighting alongside the lines were somewhat west of Brindisi at the time in the desert. When we first got to our base, they were just coming back from a flight that had been scrubbed. In other words, they'd been up in the air, but they'd changed their mission and told them to come back and land. And one of the things that we noticed is that they all just dropped their bombs. which we'd never seen before. And the plane just jumps in the air when you drop all of them at once, but nothing happens to the bombs. And then the other thing we noticed is that the bombardier didn't take his bomb sight to secure it. In training, we couldn't ever leave the bomb sight in the airplane. We had to keep it under our eye, a watchful eye. But anyway, our squadron didn't have many planes. Most of them, we were there as a replacement for the first low altitude Ploesti oil fields mission, Ploesti, Romania. And so my squadron only had a couple of airplanes until the replacements got there.
Was this a pretty crude airfield out in the middle of the desert somewhere? It wasn't an airport before?
All it was bulldozed off of a semi condition between rock and sand. It was a very soft sandstone that they were able to bulldoze smooth enough to use as an airfield. There was enough free sand in it that when we come back from missions across the Mediterranean, if it was a hot day, you could always see where our base was because there was a spiral of pink, looked like a pink cloud going up from it. Always windy, always moving sand.
Did the sand get into everything as you were living there, and did it affect the planes themselves, the engines?
It sure did. Our engines didn't last near the length of time that they did in the U.S. They all had problems. As a result, Air Force had a rebuilding base in Cairo, and we'd have to constantly fly back for new engines from Benghazi to Cairo.
How long was a mission like that? And I know we're going to get into your experience with that. How long did you have to fly just to get there from North Africa?
We had to fly a long time. Our missions, we had a lot of 12-hour missions, and very few down to 6 or 8. That's the first part of my flying from Benghazi. From Benghazi, we were transferred to, they were getting ready to move aircraft and that, I guess, to England. And so anyway, we were in the 9th Air Force, and we were transferred to the 12th, and that was we found a base south of Tunisia. To show you how we found the base, our commanding officer sent a plane over with 2 navigators on it, and they plotted, they were looking for a dry lake bed, and they found one, got the coordinates, and then the group moved there. It worked fine except when it rained, which it did a couple of times. You better not be on the field because it'd fill up fast.
Actually, since you were talking about Ploesti there, the first raid of Ploesti happened. This was, what, 1943 at this point?
Yes.
Okay, and that you weren't on that raid, but
No,
you were a replacement.
I was a replacement.
Okay. Did you have any? Did you talk to any of the crews that came back from that? Did you get some sense of what was about to happen when you were about to go over on those long-range missions?
We did. We talked to several of the crews, and they didn't tell you too much. Most of them were pretty shook up. I remember talking to one fellow that I had known in Salt Lake. I worked at as part-time, I worked at a milk laboratory in downtown Salt Lake, and this fellow was a night watchman. Well, that's what he did to go to school. And he ended up being a general at 28. And I remember an interview that I read in one of the military magazines. The reporter asked him, "How do you become a general at your age, 28? He says, "It's easy." And he says, "How?" And he says, all you have to do is all the guys above you go down. And he ended up the general for the, he was being transferred out at that time, and he transferred to England and headed the, let's see, it was the 12th Air Force when they transferred, and it was on the invasions that happened in England later. He was a commanding officer.
Getting back to Eric's question about Pulaski interviews, what were they telling you?
Pulaski.
Pulaski.
They just said it was hell. It was a low level, and they had some mix-ups, so that they brought in extra groups from England and trained in the desert in low altitude flying, and then so they'd all get pretty much able to fly together. But they did have some mix-ups where the groups had ended up flying through the prop wash with one of the other groups, and that gave them some extra trouble. Also, they were so low that as they went over, why, if they were hit, they didn't have much of a chance to do much about it. And they had airplanes scattered all the way between there and North Africa that went down.
Low altitude was a different kind of tactic than what you'd been trained for and what other bomber units were doing at the time.
None of the bomber units had been trained in low altitude.
So this was a totally different thing than what you were expecting to do, and what the other bomb groups flying out of there were having to do.
Totally different, and but they did an excellent job. They really clobbered the place.
You did fly to Ploesti on some of the later raids, didn't you?
Yes, I flew over Ploesti 3 times, and I was the lead navigator on 2 of those for both groups.
How tough was it?
They were always tough, but you always knew if you hit it. They had three Ploestis, the real one and 2 fake ones, and they were always hoping that you'd get the fake one. But our navigation was well and good enough that we always got the right one. And you always knew if you had it, because we'd fly over it usually about 18,000 feet. And the mountains are somewhat high there, so I imagine we're about 15,000 feet above it. But when you hit it, it would look like you wouldn't be able to escape the flames. They'd come up so fast.
You mentioned fake Ploestis. What did they do? Did they just create facilities that were kind of mock facilities?
Well, they were tanks. You know, it was like an oil field, tanks, and they had tanks that I guess had nothing with them all over. And this was a real important bombing mission because they told us that that was about 1/3 of the supply of oil for everything. And as you know, the American Air Force, ours starting with, and then later after I was out, that one of the big problems with the Germans in the later times of the war is didn't have fuel.
How well was the field defended?
It had a lot of anti-aircraft, a real lot, and but we would try to fake them out. In other words, we'd turn fast as we could as a big group, and we usually didn't have too many planes, so we turned pretty fast. The last time I led, we had I imagine 300 or 400 airplanes, and so you couldn't turn fast. And they did get a lot of our planes. Never hit us.
Tell us a little bit about Colonel Kane. He was a rather famous figure in that.
Colonel Kane was our CO, and he was led the Air Force over Pulaski on that low-level mission, and for it he he was one of the first men to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he was a real character. I flew as his navigator about 3 times, and we did some strange things. He was his own boss. For example, he could speak German. And one time when he was coming back from a mission to Benghazi, this is before I was over there, but when coming back from a mission out of Benghazi, the Germans was bombing his field. And he got on the phone with them in German. He told them to get the hell out of there or he was going to bomb their rest homes. And he knew that, he told them he knew that they had rest hotels on the island of Crete, and he'd get them. Anyway, he was able to bring his troops in. I don't know whether that affected the Germans' flight or not, probably didn't. But later, when I was his navigator one time, we flew to get the pig pens on the east end of Crete. And there were so many of our ships being sunk by submarines that that was a prime target. And so anyway, we got there and was coming over the target at about 18,000 feet. And he come on the radio and he broke silence because he went to the whole group. Said, "Does anybody see any fighters?" And the answers were negative. He didn't see any. And he says, and then he directed me. He says, "Take a 180, come back over at 10,000 feet." So that's what I did. We come back over, and I think we bombed them very well from 10,000 feet. As soon as we threw our bombing run, he come on the phone again and he said, "Do you know how to do a grid search?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "All right, do a grid search from the east end here back and forth until we cover the whole island of Crete." And so that's what I did. Of course, the rest of our group went on, but he and our plane and one more followed us, and we did the grid search. I never found out till later, he never told me why, but what he was doing, he was looking for those hotels. And he still had some bombs. We never found any, but we were so late getting back to our base in North Africa that the squadron navigator, when he was interviewing me, asked me why we did that. He says, I told him, and he says, "You didn't do that." He says, this log has got to be changed. And I says, "How?" And he says, "You got to put on there the regular time when you were briefed to be back. That's when you got back."
How many missions did you fly, and what was your worst experiences? And
Our mission order was that we would fly 50 missions. I flew 52. The reason I flew the extra 2 was because I flew with our colonel as a lead navigator twice in his plane and without my crew. So my crew they get pretty nervous as they get to the end of just 2 or 3 missions left. And so they wanted me to be their navigator, and so I obliged.
why don't you tell us about the aircraft, the approximate size, the engines, what it was like inside?
Well, the aircraft has a 110-foot wingspan and about 90 feet length. We had a tail turret, a top turret, and a bottom turret in our plane. Our plane was a 24D and did not have a nose turret. Had two guns in the nose in plexiglass, mounted in the plexiglass, and it was so that the navigator could use one and the bombardier the other one. Then there was a little pull-down table, just like a piece of plyboard, the width of the airplane and about 3 foot wide, that hinged up for when you were using guns so you could move around. The guns are helped with weight with elastic ropes because they are heavy, 50 caliber, and the bombardier sit down in front, and I stood at the table for the navigator. In our plane, and as most of them, the radio operator was also the top turret gunner, and then we had a separate gunner for the tail and for the bottom gunner. Inside the compartment which we were in, which is right immediately back of the pilot, which it was just about where the wings go through, there's a astrodome so that we could use our sextants. Astrodome is just a round dome of plexiglass that you could put your instrument up in and be able to see the stars.
As we've talked to a lot of people, there's kind of a little rivalry between the B-24 guys and the B-17 guys. And,
Oh, that's true.
what was the difference between those planes from your perspective?
Well, I'd have to say the best thing going for the B-24 is it was a little bit faster. It could carry a little bit more bombs. But the main thing is they mass-produced it, had so many of them.
How about armament? Were they equally armed?
Equally armed. Yeah, each had a crew of 10 and guns to match.
Were there more B-24s in Southern Europe?
Yes. There, the time I was flying, there were only two groups of 17s and two groups of B-24s. And then the replacements started coming in, and they were all 24s. New groups came in at 24s. We were the first ones in Italy. The four groups, two 17 groups, two B-24 groups, and we were the first ones in we were the nucleus of the 15th Air Force. But all the new groups that came in, and they started coming in pretty fast, were signed to the 15th, all the heavies, and they were pretty much in the Foggia area where they based them.
You had 52 missions, Vern, and it's not coming across to me where most of those were, what kind of problems you had, maybe from fighters or flak, what your war experiences actually were during those trips.
Our first trips, we went to always across the Adriatic, across the Mediterranean from Benghazi, and we had things up on the east side of the Adriatic and all the southern part of Italy, and then of course we bombed Sicily. Our troops were at Sicily at the time, and we bombed a lot there, and we even bombed in around Tunisia in support of the troops there. Later on, as we got, when we moved after the American troops had moved through that part of Sicily, why that's when we moved to the Sicily base, which, by the way, it's on the west side of Bay of Benghazi, and Benghazi's on the east side of Bay of Benghazi. But then we were flying missions into Upper Italy and even as far up as Austria.
Were the conditions in Southern Europe different from what the guys in England were flying through? Was there less resistance? Was there different kind of targets, or what were the differences flying out of Africa or Italy?
I think I can best answer that by going on to our next target, our next place. That was in the 12th Air Force. then we moved to Brindisi, Italy, and at the time we moved to Brindisi, Italy was just after the invasion of the west coast of Italy, which we participated in bombing. And but we flew into Brindisi. There were no troops there. The Germans had evidently moved. They thought they had all gone, and we just picked up and two groups, the 376th and the 98th, and we just flew into Brindisi one day. One of the interesting things is that Brindisi's on the east coast, just across from Albania, and as we flew in this day, we saw a great big monument coming up right out of the water. It was a pig pen area for the Italian Navy. Pig pens is where you store submarines. Anyway, there was a grain and not swastika, but the symbol of the Italians on the top of this monument. And we all noticed it. It was so prominent as we came into land at Brindisi, which was a nice air base with cement runways. In flying to check our engines, and a day or two later, we noticed something different. The Italian symbols had all been chiseled off. It was just a plain rock monument going up in the air. It was very cold where we flew at such high altitude, usually above 20,000 feet, and so we all wore what we called bunny suits. And what they are is they're just an electric blanket that's built in a shape of coveralls, and you wear it under your coveralls, which our flight suits were coveralls. And there was only one major thing wrong with those things, and that is that after so long a wear, the wires would cross and at your elbows usually, and so your fingers would be freezing and your elbows burning. But they were a saver for you at 50 below.
Didn't you get some better flight suits later in a rather unconventional way?
Yeah, we whenever we could get friendly enough with the British to get some of theirs had 2 circuits in them. And the 2 circuits, if one went out, you could turn it off, and you had a pretty good deal. But one or two of the fellows found some because this was on a base that had been formerly the Germans had been on. They found some German suits, and they had 8 circuits, and so that was the cream of the crop. If you could get one of those, I never was lucky enough to get one. In Brindisi, we were so close to the German Air Force, which had a base in Albania, which is only about 35 miles away, that our British Spitfires covered us on landings and takeoffs, because as you know, a heavy bomber is very vulnerable, and you couldn't do anything about it if a fighter came at you on landings or takeoffs. So these Spitfires would fly 2 at a time and cover us. And usually the British did different than we did. They trained their cadets. Their cadets flew with a experienced pilot, even on these kind of missions. And it was interesting because we'd listen to them on the radio, and they'd cuss out the instructor'd be cussing at the guy all the time for not doing anything right. And if he got up there and got a German fighter that would come over, all he'd say is, "Good show, let's go back to base." One of our favorite targets was Vienna, because there was an aircraft factory there. We went there. We'd go to Brenner Pass because all the munitions that the Germans sent in had to come through Brenner Pass. And Brenner Pass was one of our tougher missions. The reason being that the mountains were high enough that you could not go crossways to the tracks. You had to go along the tracks if you're going to do any good bombing the tracks. And the reason because we did that, the tracks were filled with flat cars with 88 millimeter cannons shooting at you. So it was one of our tougher missions because the fact that you had to stay over the guns so long. I might say here that one of the things that I think saved the American Air Forces is that the Germans had a very accurate 88 millimeter gun shoot at you from the ground, but they didn't have a proximity fuse in it. Now the Americans had a 90 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. It had a proximity fuse, which meant that if it came close to an aircraft, the bomb exploded just before it hit. The Germans didn't do that. We had the Germans 88 millimeters go through our planes all the time. In fact, one time we had it go through an engine, knocked out 4 cylinders, and still didn't explode or kick us out of the air. And we'd get them through the body and the wings repeatedly. They'd even go through gas tanks without, you'd hope that it'd go through a full tank because it does, all you lose is the gasoline.
How did they gauge, how these things would explode? If they weren't a proximity fuse, what did they try to do with those?
Time. They exploded on time, and they would calculate the time, your altitude, and set the timing fuse. And that's why we threw out this window. As we went over a target, why our gunners were busy throwing out, we called it window. What it is it's shredded like tinsel on a Christmas tree. And we had it in the back of the plane by the bale. The bale's almost as big as a bale for feeding cattle. But that loused up their radar, and they couldn't figure your altitude correctly, and so therefore they had set their fuses wrong. And generally they'd set them too high is the reason that we had got holes in our planes from them going through. We'd go to Regensburg, Germany. In fact, one of my best friends, fellow navigator, and was flying wing to us, went down on a mission to Regensburg.
Were you able to get fighter cover for portions of these trips, or was it beyond the range of the fighters when you got that far north?
We were beyond the range of the fighters usually, but later on when we moved up to Brindisi, Italy was our next move. We went from the 12th Air Force to the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force was just formed then, and it was strictly all heavy bombers. And then we started flying to Wiener Neustadt and up all through the upper Balkans and southern Germany and Austria, as well as northern Italy.
There's a group of Tuskegee Airmen that are active here in Colorado. I think there's 9 of them, and a lot of them flew out of southern Europe. Did you ever have any experiences with them as fighter escorts? Or?
They were fighter escorts for us 2 or 3 times. As far as I know, they did a good job, but we never saw our fighter escorts hardly ever. I can tell you some interesting things about escorts. For example, coming back from Palesti one time, we had a B-17, which was our first escorts, our what's the twin engine? It's not 17. P-38. They're the twin engine fighter, and that was our first escorts we ever had. And the P-38, this one time coming back, coming west towards Brindisi, and we got a radio call from him that he wanted to ask if he could fly under our wing. He had lost an engine, but that slowed him up to where he was at our speed, and he got some lift from our wing, and so he flew under us for a couple hours on the way back. As we come off from Albania, he lost it. In other words, I don't know whether he ran out of fuel or what, but he had to ditch the plane. And he ditched the plane right off of the west coast of Albania. And because they're so vulnerable, and the Germans would go down and get them, even in a lifeboat. He was sitting in a lifeboat, and we went down and circled him until a rescue plane, PBM, came out and picked him up. And he got home before we did. The reason we circled him is that a fighter can't come in on a bomber very well that's down on the water, because they go so much faster than you do that as they come in, if they're able to shoot you, also they're probably going to go into the water. So that was a safety net for him.
You keep referring to we were flying. What kind of what would be the average size of a formation, and on how many missions approximately would you run into trouble and actually lose some of your aircraft?
There wasn't very many missions that we didn't run into trouble. Our first missions, as I said, was no escort, and we just had to rely on our formation, and we'd fly in we had two groups, and in a group there's 4 squadrons. You start out with 7 planes each in a squadron. Usually you have 1 or 2 turned back, so you're running with 5 or 6. In other words, engine trouble or something else. And we were able to do pretty well against fighters because being that small a group, we could maneuver well. For example, if we got hit from the side, we stacked. In other words, instead of our side planes pulled in, and we were just like a wall. And when you take 10 guns, then facing a fighter from each plane, you got a pretty good way of getting at them. They can't come through that barrage of fire. Some of them would dive. Of course, they always like to come in at you from the sun, and that's a little tougher. But we usually did pretty well with the fighters.
Did your aircraft, personally, anything you were in, ever experience any hits, any flak, any damage, any problem?
We had, I can't remember a mission or more than 1 or 2 missions when we didn't get hit, with flak at least. But I'll say this, the safest place to be when you're flying like that is in the lead plane. And other times we got hit from fighters. For example, one of the bombing missions to Regensburg, as we come off the target, we got hit with 20 millimeters guns from a fighter, and he hit into our tail, and it got our stabilizer. The stabilizer on B-24, there's one on each side, and there's about a 3-inch bar between them that works it. And we got a bullet, and it took half of one of those out, and it was hard to move because it was in the housing and it was all screwed up from the hit. And so what we did is we fell out, and we come right down the Alps over the Po Valley, and we flew the Po Valley at about 50 feet and came out onto the Adriatic, and we stayed down at about that level because the pilot didn't dare really jerk it to go higher or anything. As long as he could keep it stable, he kept it there. And at that time we were based at Brindisi, or excuse me, Manduria, which is south of Brindisi and in the plains in the instep of Italy. But there's high cliffs on the east side of Italy from about Brindisi clear down to the heel. So we flew down around the heel and then back in the instep to Manduria and landed. The only problem was that we were on such a long mission that we were reported missing in action, and in fact my mother had a telegram we were missing in action. And of course they knew we were there 3 hours later, but nobody thought to send anything back. Another telegram telling her that what had happened. So I had a pretty worried mother for a while.
Did you ever have a plane get shot down that you were in?
No, I was never shot down.
Nor did you have to ever bail out?
Never had to bail out. I came close one time. We was flying out of Manduria, and our target was the railroad between the Vatican and Rome. And that's not very much space, but that's where the Germans were putting in all their ammunition and guns to fight us on Anzio. America had made the invasion of Anzio, and that was the German supply route to get to the front. And so our job was to bomb those rail lines, and which we did. And I think we did a good job on them. The only trouble is they did a good job on us. And we lost 2 engines, and we lost the ability to turn except in one direction. We could only turn to the right. And my pilot ordered bailout. And I called him back on the phone. I said, we don't need to bail out. I can get you into Naples because it's not that far. And he says, yeah, but we're losing altitude awful fast. And I said, well, we started out awful high. And if you'll go with me, I'll get you into Naples. So we made a series of circles and got into Naples. The only trouble is when we landed at Naples, we'd also lost our hydraulic fluid and our wheels came back up and it chewed off the nose, which is where we sit regularly, but we didn't ever sit there in landing or takeoff. We were back in the main part of the plane.
Vern, did the military give you any recognition for all the efforts you went to?
They sure did. I got a DFC and also 8 air medals.
What was the DFC for, do you remember?
Yes, the DFC was for the mission over the railroad tracks between the Vatican and between the Vatican and Rome, where we were hit by anti-aircraft fire. We lost controls on our tail and it made it so we could only turn in one direction, and we lost a couple of engines, and so we started losing altitude fast. The pilot ordered bailout, but I knew that we were very close to Naples, and while we were high in the air and we're losing altitude fast, I told him that we could keep circling and I could get them into Naples, which I did.
You mentioned the DFC. What does DFC stand for?
Distinguished Flying Cross. I feel honored that I have it, yes.
Isn't that an award generally reserved for the pilots?
Usually the more pilots get it than any other aircrew. But in this case, I guess the fact that I rescinded or tried to rescind the pilot's order and got them to keep the people in the plane and saved the airplane. But there was a nice side to that. It gave us 2 weeks vacation, and we went over to the Isle of Capri, went down to Pompeii. It was a little embarrassing. We met some nurses, and we took them down to Pompeii, and we didn't know what we was going to see before we got there. Didn't know there were so many naked things in Pompeii. And we were with the nurses. But they took it all in good stride.
You mean statuary and?
Statuary, pictures on all the walls everywhere, all nude.
After the 52 missions, when did you get back over to the States? You completed the 52 missions.
I got orders, as did our all the ones at that time. We got orders to, instead of going home, instead of being through our combat, we got 30 days leave, and we were assigned to the air base nearest our home. And we went back by ship, and then we went home, and I was assigned to Hill Air Force Base, just out of Ogden, Utah. And as such, I was real lucky in one respect, is that they expected us to give speeches and tell about the war and that as a goodwill gesture. Anyway, the man that was in charge of it in Utah was a Hal Moffett, who was the attorney for the company that I worked for, and so he was pretty easy on me.
Is the war still going on?
I was home for D-Day.
You were.
And the reason that they give us those kind of leave instead of fulfillment is that they didn't know how D-Day was going to go, and they wanted to be sure they had enough troops or enough aircraft and crews if they needed them. And so we went back to Italy, and we went in at Naples, and we went to a replacement depot and sit and waited to get assigned. And the D-Day went so well that we were there 3 months and sent home again.
And that's the end of your war.
That's the end of my war.
When did you start to talk about the war? Was it a long time after you got back?
I think about the time you fellows got to me. Right after the war, there was no need to talk about the war. Practically everybody I knew had been to the war and were tired of it and didn't talk about it. And after that, talking to anybody about the war, none of them understood it anyway.
Well, you had school to complete, you had careers to try to make.
That's right.
You know, life had to go on, and raising a family.
And you kind of wanted to forget it.